Welcome to the Discovery Pod, where we talk to leading experts from the University of Adelaide about solutions to society's most pressing challenges. Unnatural, harmful and unsafe. Does genetic modification really have a role to play in our food futures? Today, I'm joined by Matt Tucker, Associate Professor and leading plant scientist. Morning, Matt.
Morning, Andy.
We've been changing our food to suit our needs for generations, but controversy has surrounded genetically modified foods since they were introduced in the late 20th century. Why has there been such a strong backlash against GM foods? Are they really that bad for us? Or can they help us improve food production in the face of a changing climate and shifting nutritional demands? And how do we help people make informed food choices? So, unnatural, harmful and unhealthy. Those are the criticisms that are often levelled at GM foods. Let's start with unnatural. Matt, maybe if we could unpack some of those a little bit and go on a journey of exploration into GM foods.
Sure. Yeah, well, GM foods are produced from a number of sources, and I'll talk about GM plants as an example. And we've been producing plants, varieties for seeds, fruits, any of the things we consume for a long time, thousands of years, and that's typically done by what we would call crossing or hybridization. We take two different plant varieties together, we identify that they've got some good properties and good traits, and we combine them together. And in that process, we mix hundreds, if not thousands, of different genes together. We select in the progeny of those plants and we identify the one that looks fantastic. It may have good yield, it may have a nice big grain, and that's the one that we choose to work on.
So since we've, since civilized has become settled, since the time of the Fertile Crescent and 5,000 years ago, where new wheat was domesticated, we obviously had the domestication of rice. That's what we've been doing. We've been selecting for the best types, the ones that taste the best or are most suited to the environment, and using those as a basis for our crops that we need to eat and as our food source.
Exactly, and that diversity always comes back to the genes, and we know that now, and that's what's happened over the past 30, 40 years, is we've been able to pinpoint the genes that actually explain that diversity in those lines, in those cultivars. And so now what we can do is we can actually use some very cool techniques, molecular biology techniques, genetic techniques, and we can find the gene that might be responsible for the property or the trait that we want. Let's say it's a big grain, for example, or a very nutritious grain, and we can identify that, we can clone that gene, and that gives us the potential to actually modify that gene to increase its level or decrease its level in our plant of interest.
So it sounds like a good thing. Why then is there the kind of controversy around GM if it sounds like it's a more precise way to introduce good traits, whether they be nutritional traits or improved production? Why the controversy?
Well, it's been a very interesting experience probably growing up in this field and seeing how it's changed. I think probably in the late 80s and early 90s, when it was just appearing, the sort of gene technology, genetic modification, whereby you can identify a gene and you can move it into your plant of interest, had so much positivity around it. And then it was picked up on as being, well, potentially, no, this is foreign. This is working in a lab. This is not doing what we would traditionally do. And there became this kind of negative attitude towards it based on some very interesting media from various organisations. Now, that's all good and well, but I think probably what we've seen over the past 20 years of the technologies which we have been able to adopt and have been able to deregulate and get into the field, there's been no problem. There's been no health benefit, adverse health effects. There's been strong benefits for various communities, both in the developing world, the developed world, and also in third world countries. So I think probably what we've lost sight of is the science behind GM and gene technology. Like I said before, when you want to cross two plants together, you're effectively combining hundreds, if not thousands, of different versions of genes. Gene technology allows you to change effectively one single gene. It gives you a lot more precision, a lot more control over what you're doing, and the end product is actually going to be potentially a lot safer and easy to follow and understand than what you would find if you were actually crossing from wild relatives or diverse species to each other.
So I think, look, it's right that we should have a healthy scepticism around new technology that's introduced, particularly if it's going to be introduced into our food supply chains. So, but I think for GMs, it's probably like a 30-year hangover, isn't it, from the Franken food, and
Definitely.
we haven't really got over that initial negative press. And well, let's also be clear that there were some pretty questionable kind of new products that came on, scorpion toxin that was going to be introduced into leaves that never got permission, but there were some pretty out there suggestions, I think, when the GM technology first came around. But I mean, aside from food, we have accepted kind of the technology behind genetic modification in a range of other products that we happily consume and have done for years. Do you want to go into that in a little bit more detail?
Exactly. I think a classic case is insulin, and that's been a massive change. That's a product which we'd normally used to harvest from animal organs in order to generate enough, but with technological developments, we've been able to identify the gene that we can use to effectively make insulin. We can express that in a bacterial solution, a GM solution, and then we've been able to harvest that insulin from that, which is life-changing for a lot of diabetics.
So the bacteria is modified so that it produces insulin, and then
That's
insulin
right.
is harvested from that fat.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a wonderful use of the technology. It's also, we're seeing it in modern times with the search for a vaccine that we might need for COVID or any other virus that we might be challenged with in the near future. We can use GM as a way to help try and create those vaccines by expressing the part of the protein or the vaccine that we want to use in a bacterial solution or some sort of vector that we can use, and then that can be harvested and purified, and we can use that to help develop the vaccine which will get tested on humans and effectively can help us defend against a lot of the diseases that we face.
And the actual technological base of genetic modification, I mean, it's not just something that was a completely synthetic process that was invented in the lab. It actually comes from, we're harnessing nature's processes to actually produce those.
Yeah, particularly in plants, I think it's an amazing process. It's actually built upon the knowledge that there's a certain soil bacteria which can infect plants. It's a natural process. And in the process of infecting those plants, it actually transfers some of its DNA into the plant. And so what scientists have been able to do is we've been able to identify that part of the DNA which normally gets transferred in by the bacteria and replace some of the genes that it's normally transferring in, and you can therefore get your gene of interest into the host plant. And it's happened naturally for many of our plants that we eat and consume. There's been a recent paper which came out that identified 20 of the sort of fruits and vegetables that we eat as part of our standard diet. There's evidence that they were actually infected and transformed by this bacteria at some point in their history. So yeah, it's happening naturally. Scientists have just been able to work out the details and add a little bit more precision to the process to get the outcome that we're after.
So it's just like brewing and fermentation. That's a natural process. We've taken that on board to produce copious amounts of alcohol because it's not good for us. Anyway, anyway, we've been able to harness that for our own purposes. And okay, so thanks for going through the background behind that. But what are some of the good things that have been able to do using this technology? So how is it helping us feed the world?
So there's a number of applications of GM, and we've talked about particularly in terms of health benefits, say through vaccines, but in terms of nutritional benefits and helping, I guess, agronomic benefits, so how we can actually grow our plants in environments which are challenging, has been really important, and that's really developing now with a great amount of momentum. So there's no denying that our environment is changing for whatever reason that might be. And that means we have to keep speed with our plant varieties that we grow. And I'm talking mainly about plants here, but if you take wheat, for example, or barley, which is about combined, it's about a $12 to $14 billion industry for Australia. As our environment is heating up, as the temperatures are rising, we're actually losing yield effectively every year.
Right.
And so we're looking for ways to counter that. And for example, GM is one way that we can do that. We've been able to identify genes that convey heat tolerance to those plants. It allows them to produce grain, or firstly flowers and then grain in those adverse environments. So, but then probably closer to home and more up to date is things like canola and safflower. So GM canola is being grown in most states in Australia, has been grown around the world for a number of years as a way to produce seeds which are going to produce high levels of oil that we can use for canola oil, which we consume. And there's a new recent sort of variety coming out, which is safflower, where the oil content of the seeds have been engineered for high levels of oleic acid. And this is actually being used as a substitute for the petroleum industry. So by extracting that oil, you can actually use it as an alternative to fossil fuels. So not so much in the food angle am I talking about there, but I guess canola oil is. What we're seeing also is there's quite some research going on in other countries, a lot of developing countries, to try and develop their staple foods to carry resistance against diseases. And this has been particularly problematic with things like cassava, where they've been able to engineer them to be resistant against bacteria which would normally wipe out the whole crop. So that's another example where it's made a big difference. Cotton, most of the cotton we wear is GM. There's no denying that's increased the yield and the outputs of cotton growers incredibly around the world. So yeah, there's a number of angles that you can take for GM to show some benefits. Biofortification I haven't really touched on. This is the ability to modify the nutrient content of a particular grain. There's some nice examples in terms of rice, which have been used before. So this is golden rice, where the levels of vitamin E precursors were increased, which is the aim of that is to try and combat blindness in some of our Southeast Asian countries. And look, that's faced challenges in terms of getting through regulatory loopholes. And a lot of opposition from various groups, but it's demonstrated that it can be done. It took too long to get there for it to be actually worth the effort, I would suggest.
And so we're moving, because with rice and grains, obviously they provide a very important source of calories for most of the world.
Yep.
I mean, 80% of the calories or whatever from plant-based products come from just 3 crops. But a lot of those was just around calorie provision, whereas you're talking about kind of functional foods that provide a more complete nutritional profile, and so it's not only around calories, it's also around nutrition, which is really important.
Yeah, the argument is that you can go down to your local chemist and you can buy a fibre supplement or a nutrient supplement.
Yeah, get a little bottle of
Exactly.
pills and yeah.
But really the aim is to try and bring these foods into your everyday diet without you having to do that. Should you go and eat bread, where you get it from the bakery, or whether it's from Woolies or Coles or whoever you get it from, that should be of a certain level, containing enough nutrient and be healthy enough that you can actually ingest it and eat it and actually get the benefits. So look, you can argue for both effectively, but I think probably we're looking for whole grain, whole food, value-added products as we move forward to the future.
Yeah. So before we let GM foods off the hook completely, let's just go, because some of the other concerns, I think, around GM, and as you said, we were right to have concerns around these, around new technologies that come in, is around being unhealthy or the problem within the environment, and then unhealthy for us. So what are some of those concerns, and what are the basis of those?
So there's really very limited evidence, or no evidence whatsoever, to say there's actually any nutritional difference between a GM food crop and a non-GM food crop. The only difference is that you might find, for example, if you take a typical plant which is grown on a farm which is not growing GM, there may be slightly higher nitrogen levels in that particular plant versus one that is growing with GM. Maybe it's got slightly higher levels of another compound, but nothing to do with nutrition. They both can give you what you need, and in fact, the GM alternative might give you a higher nutritional value. So that's been one suggestion, that there's some nutritional difference between them, but you can put them in a lab and you cannot tell the difference between them. So that's not really a a very valid criticism.
And the difference wouldn't be due to the process to create that crop. The difference would be due to the characteristics of that crop at the end of the day, wouldn't it? Yeah.
That's right. So it's the product, and this is something important when you think about regulations in Australia. Australia, we regulate the process. So how did we actually make that GM crop and that foodstuff in the first place? Whereas other countries, such as the US, regulate the end product. What have you got on the table in front of you? Can you actually see any difference between it? There's no difference between it, therefore it's not considered different.
Okay, so the US system will be more relaxed about
it. It is, and you know, there's reasons why that could be good or could be bad. I think I'm quite happy with our regulatory structure here. It protects us, and we need to know what techniques are being used, and it ensures that when we get a product on the market, it's been very heavily scrutinised. It's gone through the Office of the Gene Technology Regular, Australian, New Zealand food standards. So it's potentially Therapeutic Goods Association. There's a lot of regulations which protect us, and they do so for good reason. But when there's no difference, you know, there's no reason why it should be stopped or impeded.
So a crazy scientist like yourself can't just create a new food and then release it. It's got to go through all of the... Yeah, that's right. You probably do. But it's got to go through all of these systems, really, before it gets into our food supply, which takes 10 years.
It takes a long time, and there's, you know, the organisations that do this sort of work have to have really good structures in place. We have to have institutional biosafety committees that assess everyone who's working on GM. We have to have stewardship, so we need to know how it's stored, where it's stored, how it can be grown. Really, really strict guidelines which are put in place. It's probably one of the most highly regulated areas in Australia, particularly across the world. So, you know, when you get a GM product on the market, it's going to be pretty well scrutinised.
Through some pretty thorough testing.
Yes.
Yeah. And so just onto the final issue, which is really around, you know, bad for the environment and problems with the environment. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit for us?
That's right. So look, some opponents of GM will say, well, hang on a minute, let's take GM canola as an example, where there's one technology whereby you can spray that canola with a herbicide, and because it's been modified to be resistant against that herbicide, it will not die. However, the rest of the field, which may contain weeds of many different types or origins, they will be killed or knocked down by that herbicide.
So the canola is genetically modified to not be killed by the herbicide that's applied.
Exactly.
So it's basically a survivor within this the herbicide regime that's been put in place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, the opposition will say that, or the opponents of that will say, look, you know, if a grower is going to grow that, they're going to grow it every year, and effectively what you're going to do is you're going to be applying more and more herbicide every year, which is increasing our herbicide load. It's affecting the biodiversity potentially in that area. But the reality is, when you've sprayed that field with that herbicide, which any other grower will do, whether it's an organic grower or a normal sort of commercial grower, they'll have to use herbicide. You do that with GM canola, you do it once, you knock everything out, and there's pretty good anecdotal evidence that's come from growers in Victoria that suggests that they have not had to apply a herbicide again on that field for upwards of 5 years. So, you know, you can put canola in 1 year, the next year you'll rotate and put something like barley or wheat in, which is probably your higher value crop, and you don't have the weed problems that you might have had historically. So actually the argument that we're using more pesticides or more herbicides in GM crops is not accurate, and there's not really any evidence to suggest that. In fact, it tends to be the other way. Even an organic grower who, you know, is doing a fantastic job of using non-synthetic compounds, however, they may have to spray their crop 4 or 5 times a season and every year in order to get the same sort of benefit from their field. So that's not a great argument to use. So yeah, there's certainly some evidence that it's reducing the use of herbicides and pesticides, particularly in those areas that are prone to weeds and certain pests.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, again, the basis of that is not necessarily a problem with the technology of how you arrived at a herbicide-resistant crop. It's, you know, more due to farming practices and how you implement those within the field, and how you integrate new crop varieties that have new performances into that established system. Because, you know, nobody would argue that we should be maintaining soil health, and
particularly a grower.
Particularly a grower, and so but the GM crops are not diametrically opposed to that outcome at the end of the day.
But look, GM food crops in particular are part of a strategy, and it's like a toolkit. You know, you need, when you're in the kitchen, you need different utensils to do different things, and you're going to cook them in different pots and pans, and you're going to use different spatulas, and you know, GM is a bit like that when it comes to farming. It's not going to be a solution for everyone, but there may be a need for it in a particular part of a strategy, and that could be more prominent depending on where you are growing. So high rainfall areas, perhaps where you have more likelihood of weeds, then maybe it becomes a solution there. But you know, potentially in lower rainfall areas, maybe that's not the solution for you. I think it's just important to remember that, you know, farmers do care about their fields. They're obviously, they're investments for them and have been for a long time. And I guess I'm talking a lot about the farmers and the growers here, but it's a good reason to maintain the health of our soil, is to make sure we're doing the right thing with our crops. And if GM's part of that, then that's a good thing.
Yeah. But there are other production areas where GM is not part of the mix. So we are seeing some areas in Australia where, you know, some of the GM production has been relaxed in certain states, but then you're seeing certain production regions saying, well, we're going to go GM free because it potentially affects our organic status. So, but that's okay. We can have different speed or different implementations of the GM policy based on consumer preferences as well.
Exactly. Look, there's really clear evidence that you can actually coexist. The United States is a great example. They've got a massive organic industry, flourishing organic industry, yet they're one of the highest users of GM technology as well. So,
but they wouldn't be doing it in the same location, would
not
they?
in the same location. There has to be some distinction between those. But there's, you know, when we grow GM, if we talk about GM crops, there needs to be exclusion zones around those GM crops to make sure that we don't have that bleed through. And that's going to be something that we need to address even better in the future in terms of stewardship, how we make sure we're doing the right thing when we've got that GM technology ingrained to use. But, you know, you think about Victoria, you know, great wine areas such as the Yarra Valley, you know, they still exist in Western Australia, Margaret River, and yet Victoria and Western Australia have been able to grow GM crops. So South Australia hasn't had that opportunity until just recently, and we'll find out in the years to come how beneficial it's been, particularly to the state as a whole. It's suggested that there'll be a monetary value gain for our state by being able to grow GM crops. And that's something we need to consider as we're moving forward for regional areas and young people coming forward that want to know what they're going to work on in the future and what they're going to study, and that's an area that we need to consider.
And we'll probably see the grain producing areas adopt potentially some of that technology, whereas areas like Kangaroo Island, which probably plays more on its organic kind of status and those kind of crops, will probably remain GM free. And there'll be certain areas across the mainland which will mix and match according to their products.
True. It depends on the technology. You know, we're talking about canola a lot here, but I think probably over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see other interesting products come onto the market.
Right, okay.
And you know, the technology is not going to stop. So GM will be, eventually someone will come over and design something better than GM. And we've seen those technologies actually happening and appearing now.
And it's probably true that the label GM has been applied to a range of changing technologies over the years. So GM from 30 years ago is not GM today, is it? But it's still carried the hangover of the label with it through that. Yeah. So for students potentially coming into university and are interested in this area, interested to help, you know, feed the world and really get involved in food security, what do you think are going to be some of the horizons of research in the next 3 to 5 years, or investigation or learning, that we're really going to need to deploy people around to tackle some of these problems?
Things haven't really changed that much. You still need people who are smart in the fundamental research area. So understanding how we can see how genes work and how they can talk to each other and how you can modify them in plants or animals or whatever bacterial solution or system you want.
And that's basically what you do. You find out what the genes do, and then you might be interested in one and then go, oh, that might have a use. Or you might be directed by a certain production outcome, and then you go hunting for genes. And I guess some of the problems, some of the early wins were relatively easy, but I guess with some of the environmental resistance, it's a much more difficult topic, isn't it, to actually get that? Yeah.
Look, I think the key is also communication. Extension is really important now. Industry is very interested in new technology. They want to partner with research bodies, universities. They want to know what technologies are available and what they should be looking for. So as breeding technologies improve, as growers get interested in those sort of technologies, as the whole industry does, we need to be able to communicate with those people. So I think extension is really important. So students who know how to communicate, can engage with many different people, those soft skills are actually really, really important for us, as important as it is to actually understand the technology and to do the research in a lab too. So, and then the field, actually getting out into the field and having the plants and being able to look at the plants, and whether it's, once again, I'm talking about plants, but it could be animals as well. That's really important. We need observant people that can understand what industry wants and how we can deliver it. And that's certainly going to be the future, I think.
And maybe if we'd have had some of those soft skills at the start of the GM debate, we might not be in the problem that we're in today. It reminds me very much of the climate change kind of issues. The scientists carried on just saying, well, we're right.
Yes.
And we're kind of tone deaf to how that was being perceived by groups, and also the rhetoric and the messaging didn't change based on that. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you put them in the same boat effectively. GM, climate change, anti-vaccination, all those sorts of things, which are scientifically it's very easy for us to explain and to understand to each other. But when it comes to actually engaging with the public and saying, no, we're doing this for this reason, you really need to do it, and it's going to have this benefit, perhaps we've missed that opportunity. So I hope that all the students I can get into my lab and recruit have those skills, and moving forward, that'll make it easier.
So arming them for a post-truth world.
Yes.
Well, Matt, thanks very much. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thanks for joining us on the Discovery Pod.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Discovery Pod, brought to you by the University of Adelaide.